Hi, hello, good evening to everybody. Welcome here at camp. Welcome to everybody who's watching online. I'm so glad that we almost filled this area. I just want to remind you that it's mandatory to wear a mask here inside, so I would please ask anybody who doesn't wear it to wear it. I'm sorry. This event will be in English. If you are not sure that you would understand for the whole time or you want to help with the translators, feel free to borrow the headphones. My colleagues and custodians will give you them. I want to clarify one thing also, because we are having JAJA architects here today for Urban Talks. So many of you know that they were selected in the shortlist of Vltava Philharmonic Hall competition. And they are having a standalone presentation. It's because we started to set up this talk even before the competition was announced. So they are even more lucky that they were selected in the shortlist. Good luck for them in the competition, but there will be Q&A afterwards, so please don't ask about the competition because it's still running, it's an ongoing project. And we will have talks with all the shortlists, architecture studios, since January to March, so you will have time to see them and watch their presentations. So I'm very pleased I can introduce you Robert Martin, Head of Mobility from JAJA Architects. They are based in Copenhagen. And Robert is not only the architect, but he's also got his PhD from sustainable urban mobility. So today the lecture will be more focused on mobility and how we move around the city and how the architecture can help us how to move. So Robert, welcome.
Thank you.
So I have a
Thanks.
So for starting, I have only one question for you, because I know it's your first time in Prague, and also you had a time to go through the city a bit today. So what would you say is the biggest difference, and also the similarities between Copenhagen and Prague?
Yeah, I think in terms of similarities, I think both Copenhagen and Prague have amazing beer cultures. Maybe Prague is a little bit better than the Danes. You also really value public buildings. You have this great collection of amazing architecture of public works that we also seem to have in Copenhagen. The biggest difference, as you might guess, is the amount of cyclists that we have in Copenhagen compared to what you have here in Prague. But I mean, with the ambitions of...
So you walked today just?
Yeah, I just walked.
Okay.
I just walked, yeah. Exactly.
Okay. So no bike riding here?
No, but it's fine. It's a very walkable city, and it's really enjoyable to walk around.
Okay.
So it was great.
So I hope in future you will bike as well?
Yeah, me too.
Okay, so floor is yours, into the presentation, and afterwards we'll have a Q&A. Enjoy.
Thank you. Could I have the timer on, please? Just so I can keep track of what's going on. Yeah. Thank you to Vojta, thank you to Camp for having me, thank you to all of you for coming and giving me your attention for the next hour or so. My name is Robert, and I'm the Head of Mobility of JAJA Architects. We're a small architecture and design firm based in Copenhagen, Denmark. We're actually based in one of the outer neighborhoods of Copenhagen called Nørrebro, indicated by this little white arrow just here. And what's really cool about the area is it's one of the most ethnically diverse places in all of Denmark. You have like a wide range of people there. It's also the youngest. So it's this really cool like melting pot of different cultures and like ambitious people trying out new things. It's really quite cool. And that's quite fitting, I guess, for JAJA, because we're really a diverse kind of bunch. We're probably 50% Danish, 50% from the rest of the world. And even the Danes are kind of like this unique kind of mix of different cultures. This diagram right here represents some of the different nationalities that combine to produce all the people. So even though someone might be Danish, they have Thai and Japanese parents, right? And what's really cool about this is that even though we're based in Copenhagen and kind of embody those ideals of, you know, the human scale, an appreciation for light, lots of public space, it's kind of channeling all this kind of outside culture into it, which I think is reflected in the types of projects that we do at JAJA. The other cool thing about the office, this is us here on a sunny day when it's actually warm enough in cold Scandinavia to be outside without a warm jacket, is that we're a wide range of people. We're not just architects, we're also landscape architects, we're also planners, we're also builders. And what that means is that within our core competencies, we kind of range in scale from the kind of architectural detail all the way up to the kind of regional plan. And what we try and bring into this process is that no matter at what scale we're designing at, we're trying to embody those main ideals all the way from the master plan through to the detail. And what this means is that we have a wide range of we have a portfolio with a wide range of projects, ranging from the extra small, so like kind of like artistic installations in old lighthouses in the north of Denmark, all the way up to kind of future visionary plans for the Copenhagen region in terms of mobility, which I'm going to get in to talk to you about a little bit later. Primarily though, JAJA have been trying to work with sustainability for some time now, and I guess this is something that all architecture practices should really be trying to embody and work with, seeing as there is such a big impact for the construction industry in terms of our CO2 emissions. The first kind of pillar of this idea of sustainability is biomaterials, and that's because our construction methods, especially in the modern era, has been primarily based on steel and concrete, which is like a huge production of CO2, as well as the sand that it takes to produce these materials, which is having effects all around the world. And so wherever we can, we're trying to bring in both, you know, existing forms of biomaterials, such as timber, but also highly engineered and unique, such as integrating hemp, for instance, in our buildings. An example of this is a recent pavilion that we've just completed for the Swiss Embassy in Denmark, where the project brief was not only about trying to create a pavilion that captured the amazing sights of this location, as well as providing an event space for the many things that the embassy try and hold in it, but also as a way for us to experiment with new digital fabrication techniques, and then ways of kind of manufacturing to ship it there so that it can be assembled on site easily, as well as being disassembled, so that we can kind of embody these new biomaterials into our way of working. The second pillar of JAJA is transformation. And that's because we believe in any project, it doesn't matter if it's a master plan for a new urban area or a building, is that if there's an existing building there, as much as we can, we try and retain it and recreate it within our project. And that's not only because of the kind of the climate change aspects that we want to try and preserve as much material as we can, but also the unique spatial opportunities that you get in these types of buildings. I mean, depending on the age, they have very unique characteristics in terms of construction, and we don't see that so much anymore. So it's important to try and preserve this as much as we can in the future. An example of the transformations that we're doing, and one that I think is insanely cool, is we're currently renovating Denmark's oldest castle. It's called Nyborg Slot. And as well as the renovation of the existing castle, we're actually putting on an addition to it, which in some ways is an addition because it's a new museum, but in another way it's actually just bringing back the existing gantry wall that used to be a part of this castle. The kind of challenging thing when you're working with transformation, especially with a project like this, which is over 1,000 years old, is that the form that you're seeing here today is nowhere near what it's been over the past 1,000 years. You have to imagine how many different uses, how many different owners, how many different styles have been over 1,000 years to understand the layers of history and the repair jobs that have come up over this time. And so you can see in like the patterning of the brick there, I mean, it's just kind of been patched up over years and years and years. And so one of the challenges for us is how to integrate a new building into this existing context, especially when putting in new bricks, because in some ways we want to preserve that kind of randomness that we get in the existing building, but we also need to create a construction method where you know, our bricklayers can actually follow it and use it. And so we've been using parametric tools to try and make these kind of different patterns so that they appear random while still are able to integrate into the existing brick facade. And this is hopefully going to all come up into this like, you know, beautifully carved out gantry wall that is going to be able to preserve that kind of characteristic of the old while still providing a new characteristic and a new type of architecture. Okay, the final pillar of JAJA, and one that kind of is close to my heart as the head of mobility, is mobility. And I think it's actually a bit weird for an architect to be involved with mobility. It's not really the traditional kind of, let's say, domain that architects are getting into. And for those of you that are kind of questioning what is mobility, for the past 100 years or so, it's been this. It's been the car. It's like if anyone thinks of transportation, they generally think of this because it is how we move around the world. And that's not to say that it hasn't had positive benefits. Especially over the last 100 years, we've had like amazing social and economic kind of opportunities as a society because of the car. The only problem is those kind of initial ideas of independence, being able to get around, once they kind of hit the mass, kind of the mass population, and we started redesigning cities to allow like ever more and more cars, you know, it got to a point where you couldn't actually exist in a city without a car, which is really bad. And as an architect, why I find this incredibly kind of sad is because of the spatial impact that these transportation kind of choices have on our built environment. I mean, we all know these kind of roads, the way they splinter our urban territories, or even in the case of Prague, the middle of your downtown, you just have this highway which is just kind of cutting through it. And I'm sure it helps people get around, but when you have like the National Museum, like where you can't actually cross the road at points to get to the National Museum because of these ever-expanding lanes of cars, it just gets a little bit sad, right? The cool thing is, and where a lot of JAJA's thoughts have come over, say, the last 5 years, is we seem to be at this paradigm shift in the way we move through cities and the way we conceive of mobility. In some sense, it's come through technological advancements, so things like autonomous vehicles, electric cars, but it's also come through the emergence of micromobility. I mean, 3 years ago, we didn't have electric scooters, and now they're kind of up to hundreds of millions of rides globally. The thing is, it's not also about kind of personal mobility, but you're seeing these types of vehicles, especially in Prague, things like the cargo bikes, being used for logistics. In Copenhagen, you see parents delivering their kids to school on them. It's like this crazy new like category of transportation which is coming about. The thing that I get most excited about when it comes to mobility, though, is these little devices that we kind of carry around with us every day. These like smartphones that not only kind of route our directions, like, you know, where do I want to go today, you're going to tell me, but also it allows me to choose between different mobility options. It allows me to pay for different mobility options. And that's generally what we're seeing in the world, this kind of shift from ownership to access. You know, we don't buy DVDs anymore. We kind of watch movies on Netflix. A lot of people don't buy CDs anymore, but we've kind of moved to Spotify. And this is what we're seeing in transportation, this kind of shift from having to own my own car to rather having access to a whole range of mobility choices which best suit what I want to do at this moment. And to give you some kind of sense of why this really makes sense in cities, I'm going to show you this graph of a distribution of trips for like populations, right? And the way you read it is that the bottom axis is like the distance, and the top axis is how many trips there are. And the world over, the majority of trips are under 10 kilometers. The majority of them are under 5 kilometers. And an insane amount of trips are under 2 kilometers every day. And yet we buy these cars to kind of service them. You know, it doesn't matter if we're just going to the shops, which we could easily walk to, or driving to another country in Europe. We kind of have this car that like is designed for all these trips, which means they make sense for some, but not for a lot of others. But the thing is when we start unbundling that mobility package, where we have apps that allow us to pick, you know, to have a bicycle if I want to ride 2 kilometers across the city, or a share car if I want to drive to another city in the same country. You know, you can start picking the right mobility choice for that journey. And what that means is we have an overall better, more efficient transportation system. So it's never, I mean, about replacing the car one-to-one, right? I mean, this is the kind of discussion where we hear, you know, my bicycle can't do all these crazy things with the car. Or it's like, the bus doesn't go where I need it to. It's not about these one-to-one kind of replacements of the vehicle, but rather the chaining of all different types of mobility options that are actually able to release us from this burden of private car ownership. And I get that that was a little bit maybe confusing, and to talk to the general public about this is extremely hard, because if you even mention removing a single car park, or that you might restrict vehicle access, car access in any way, you kind of divide people into two groups, those that love cars and those that hate them. And if we're going to, as a democracy, move forward, we need to find a middle ground. And that's why we've been developing this communication tool called the mobility pyramid, to try and broaden the discussion about cars or no cars, but rather maybe a little bit of cars and a lot of walking and cycling, and then a little bit of public transportation as well. Now, because that's kind of maybe an abstract concept, I like to put it into space. Now, this kind of street, what I would say is the pizza, burger, soda kind of diet. It's the 100% car diet. But when I apply the mobility pyramid principles to the street, we get this, where you can still see that there's a little bit of car in there, but there's a lot more shared cars, which kind of releases space for other modes. There's space for cargo bikes, there's space for scooters, there's space for bicycles. But I think most importantly, there's space for trees and urban nature to increase the biodiversity of the area. There's space for people and new commercial opportunities on the street, so that these spaces in our cities, which are actually the largest public space that we have, are used for more than just containers for vehicles and actually, you know, places that we can enjoy in our city. Yeah. Now, I'm an architect. And JAJA architects, we're architects. And we're very new to this whole mobility thing. And so we've been developing tools in order to work with all the other existing disciplines that have been going at this for a long time. Where we've had most success is through the combination of the methods backcasting and prototyping. Now, they're not new individually, but we think that combining them is actually proving to be quite successful for us. So this diagram represents backcasting. And I think the easiest way to explain backcasting is to say the opposite of it being forecasting, which takes historical data and then tries to project it into the future. And the problem with that is it's essentially guessing, and it gives you a lot of certainty that it's going to be correct. Backcasting does the opposite. It starts at that future vision. It's where you get all the different stakeholders together and you try and agree on a place that you want to go to. And then you work your way back with the steps, strategies, and policies in order to get there. And so an example from JAJA's end, we do a lot of research. This image is from a research project that we were doing with a transport engineering company when we were looking at the effect that shared autonomous shuttles would have in the Copenhagen region. And this particular image shows our adaptation of existing public transportation infrastructure, in this case being a train station, how it would have to adapt to incorporate those new vehicles. But as architects and urbanists, what we start to get really excited about is how that change in system actually affects the surrounding suburbs, which are otherwise car-dominated and otherwise monofunctional. And so once you start removing the amount of cars, once you start increasing the safety, you can start to have streets that have much more social interaction, you know, for places for people to come together. And I think the crazy thing about showing this image is that if you go back 100 years, this is probably how a lot of streets look like, you know, with people playing out using it. It was only once we kind of ceded these spaces to cars that we actually left them to not be used again. So that was backcasting. So the only thing about that side of the methodology is that, I mean, we don't really know if people want lots of trees and kids playing in the street. It's kind of like, I mean, I think it would be nice, but we have no idea if that's the best use of space or whether we could do it. So we kind of counteract the backcasting with prototyping, where we take that idea of the future and we put it in the present to gain knowledge, user feedback and experience about, are these the types of things that we want to do? So an example would be that we've been working with the public transport authorities to embed these new smart kind of bicycle lanes, which allow the bicycle lane to be extended or like widened, and then providing these kind of safe drop-off zones for passengers when the bus comes so they can alight without causing a conflict with the passing cyclists. We also do a number of pilot projects. This one is in the northern Danish city of Aalborg, where we've taken 90% of the parking away for a year and put in some new social functions. And that's just to test, right? Like, is this something that residents are willing to give up their parking place right outside their house for? And so now you can see where the combination of the backcasting and the prototyping are coming in this kind of yin and yang type diagram, where the backcasting and the visioning is what's kind of guiding our work today. That's like setting the agenda. But the prototyping, is taking it and giving us the knowledge in order to re-inform that vision. So it's not a static thing. We're learning every day. We're becoming more clever and hopefully making better inroads to actually get to that future step. Okay. So the rest of the presentation I'm going to divide into 3 themes that have been emerging in the last 5 years or so at JAJA in terms of our work when it comes to mobility, because it's a really, really big and broad subject. The first being turning our streets, which I've said before are our largest continuous public spaces, away from just kind of transport corridors and into what we like to call urban living rooms. Now, I think a lot of people, when they hear Copenhagen and transportation, they think bicycles, they think it's a very successful city. The city has done a very good job of branding Copenhagen in a certain way so that everyone the kind of world over thinks that this is it. And while it is in some respects, in other respects, what we're seeing in the city is an exponential increase in the amount of cars in the city center. It's insane, and it's because we're getting richer and we're not understanding those negative implications of car use because we haven't had them in the past. And so in one of the cycling capitals of the world, this is what it looks like when you walk outside your front door. You're kind of met with this wall of cars, right? You can see here, maybe it's a little bit dark, but they've actually had to repaint the parking line and take up another half of the sidewalk to accommodate the increase in car use, which I think is absolutely crazy. So at JAJA, we have to think in 2 scales, right? Like I said before, we have to kind of think at the strategic, the visionary scale, and then try and link that somehow with how people on the street experience space. And to give you an example of this, I'm going to run you through a project that roughly translates into Copenhagen Car Freedom. It's not car free, because that would be a divisive term, right? And we don't want to kind of completely exclude people that need cars. We just want to design a city where people don't feel that they need to have a car to get around. And so this is Copenhagen. I'm not sure if any of you have been here before, but one of the kind of prides of the planning system in Copenhagen is something called the finger plan, where over the last 60 to 70 years, urban development has followed these 5 fingers of rail infrastructure. And they kind of come into this dense urban fabric in the middle, like this. Right, this is basically how the cities run out. And this is so successful that it's actually one of the most accessible public transportation systems in Europe. You can see here just like how much of the city center is actually covered by easily accessible public transportation, and that's fixed line. It's not including the buses that run there or the extensive cycling network. And so at JAJA, what we've been working with is a large-scale strategy, on one hand, to kind of really try and exclude cars from this highlighted red area. But because we can't really just create a line and say this is where cars are, this is where they can't, because you're just going to push the problem out to the neighboring suburbs. There's also kind of micro strategies in all the surrounding suburbs so that they can also become their own little kind of car-free areas as well, and kind of make shifts to more sustainable mobility choices. So if we start with this kind of overall plan, we're going to zoom in to just this area. And for the next couple slides, I'm just going to kind of jump through some kind of explanatory diagrams to explain this. The way that Copenhagen's set up right now, just like Prague, is you have these roads that just kind of cut through the medieval city center. Like, I'm talking like 7 lanes. It's crazy. Like, it's not how we should be kind of treating this in a space. So one of the strategies that we've been looking at to cut this is to implement this strategy called traffic islands. And for any of you in transport, you might know this from the Belgian city of Ghent. But essentially what the strategy does is it divides the city into different zones where cars aren't actually able to drive within them, across them. So you can drive into it if you need to get somewhere, but you shouldn't be driving across these zones for trips that could be otherwise made by other choices, right? So to give you a little example, you can see here that if you're a car, the red, you would have to leave the zone and come back in and come out. Whether for bicycles, public transportations, you can just kind of cut through them. So what's that doing is it's kind of encouraging more sustainable modes because it's the easiest option, right? While still not excluding cars for those that really need them. It's this kind of way of balancing the priority. In Ghent, this has been extremely successful, and they've seen like massive car ownership sales, people adopting shared cars, and an increase in public transportation, as well as like a city that isn't full of parked cars everywhere. But on one hand, if you're taking mobility options away from people, you also need to provide them with an alternative. It's not simply about taking away cars, you kind of need to provide them something else in the same matter. And this was probably a big jump for a lot of people. But those big red roads that I mentioned before, those ones that were cutting through the city center, what we're proposing is that every second one of those becomes what we call a super boulevard, where it becomes a high-capacity corridor for public transportation and shared modes of mobility. And so what these green roads, how they really function is because you don't have cars cutting across these traffic islands anymore. So all those intersections on those big roads that were kind of slowing down the capacity of the road, they kind of get freed up to allow this transportation to go through. And so to give you an example of this, you can see in the top section of the existing where you have kind of 7 lanes of traffic, you have parking on either side, and then you have a distribution road to allow that. That gets kind of condensed into a transit way of either a bus or tram, a shared mobility lane for buses, shuttles, taxis, and then an extended cycle lane to allow more throughput for bikes. And what that does is it takes this kind of like, I mean, this is crazy. This is like the central cultural access in Copenhagen where you have like a number of museums. What it does is it takes this kind of highway that cuts through the city and transforms it into a new public space where you still allow mobility in some sense, but you actually provide these new corridors of green infrastructure that increase the amenity for pedestrians and the people who live there. And what this does is, if we go to the kind of eye height on the street, where you can see just the amount of lanes that this road is taking up. When we go to the proposal, we can see that it changes what this space is and what it feels like, where it provides that mobility options for people to still go through, while providing new recreational and climate adaptation spaces. It's really hard in Copenhagen because we have so much asphalt that when it floods, and when it rains too heavy, it floods the city because it can't be absorbed anywhere. So we need this kind of infrastructure to kind of absorb all this rainwater. But that's not to say we don't think about cars, right? Unfortunately, even in a car-free strategy, you need to consider car use in some way. And that's important because, you know, many people rely on it. It's just about thinking, how do we do it so it's not the predominant mode that people are at? Wait, so sorry, if I go back. Yeah, so these red lines. And you can see that they kind of snake in as they're coming towards the city center because people aren't crossing anymore. There's kind of an endpoint where these roads are going to. And that means that the capacity as the road as you're going further in, because people are kind of funneling off as you go in, actually gets smaller and smaller. So you can start to reduce the amount of lanes on the road the further you get into the city center until you eventually hit that kind of stop where you're going left or right. And what's really cool about this strategy is that these places where these roads are stopping, you can see on the left the way they're kind of cutting through the city center and through this historic green fortification that used to run around the city center, these places that they stop almost line up exactly with the old green fortification. So you can put in these new kind of green urban squares that relink this infrastructure that used to exist in the city. And what that means is if you take kind of the existing Copenhagen, you can reintroduce these green infrastructures that used to be there. And I really like this thought that, you know, this discussion isn't just about mobility, it's not just about transport, it's just not about cars, it's about green infrastructure, it's about people, and the many other ways that we can, by rethinking the kind of hierarchy of transportation, we can kind of create better spaces for the city. Cool. Now, this kind of project had two different scales, right? We've kind of been looking at like the arrows, you know, on a map and where different things are going. And while that's important, it's also really important to consider how this plays out on the kind of human scale. And I don't know if many of you know the kind of superblock strategy that they're developing in Barcelona, where you've got a pretty even grid structure in the city. And what they do is they make a 3x3 grid people can't drive through. So you can only drive in the perimeter of the grid, but not through the inside. And we've adopted a similar strategy here in Copenhagen. We don't necessarily have that same urban fabric that they do in Barcelona, but you can still apply these principles that you basically have any cars that are within these zones can circulate, leaving the inner streets, the kind of living streets, generally free of cars. And to give you a sense about what this looks like at kind of an urban view, where you can't necessarily see those grids appearing in that. But when you apply the principles of the superblock to it, you can see how that circulation happens around the streets on the kind of bigger roads that can absorb it. While you make the kind of the inner streets one way, you can start to make them, you know, you can route them in different ways so that you can create more spaces for other purposes on that street. And now within this strategy, you know, I showed you the kind of green and red streets, right? They're kind of like, maybe there's like 16 of them in total. But if we're talking about the living streets in Copenhagen, we're talking about thousands, and so you can't really just design each one. So what we were really interested in is developing a catalog of approaches that could be taken to individual streets that varied on their street width and their orientation, what the ground floor functions were. And so I'll just step you through one of these to give you a sense about how you kind of reach, I'll step you through one of these proposals to see how you kind of arrive at these streetscapes step by step to show you the considerations. So if this is the existing street where you can see the majority of the space is given to cars. And then our immediate thought, because we're in this new car-free area, is that we allow a street in one direction of 5-meter width, which allows a car to travel in one direction and a bicycle to go in either direction. Because it's a shared space, and because we have this excess space now, we start to put some bends into the street. Now what this does on one hand is it slows cars down naturally, because we're going to have a variety of different users using this space, but then it also kind of mixes where the space allocation on each side is, making it a much more interesting spatial response in the end. We then allow pick up and drop off, you know, so people can receive deliveries, tradesmen can come to do jobs, you know, elderly parents can come, you know, we still allow aspects of cars within it. But then one of the big moves is to provide gardens to the ground floor apartments, because these are traditionally the kind of the least desirable apartments because they don't get as much light, they don't get a balcony, so they have no semi-private space. And what these gardens do is they provide an offset to allow them, you know, some semi-private space, but also some audio and visual privacy for those people who are no longer walking just outside their apartment window. But then we also provide new social functions and social amenities and new urban nature into this street. So it's not only just for some people, it's actually for all people to kind of bring them out on the street. And so what those steps do is it turns this from being a street for only cars, but as we like to say, a living street, where there's a multiple of functions that exist within it. And what that does is it takes this kind of existing street that I said before, and then we imagine it something like this. where you can see that there are still some cars present in it, but they're not the dominating feature. You know, there's much more space for people to come in. There's much more space for green infrastructure. And primarily what I think these images start to do is it shifts this conversation a little bit away from like, oh, do I have to give up my parking space, to what do I get if I give up my parking space? Where you can start to play these trade-offs and show people that maybe there's a better use of our public space. Cool. So now we're up to the second theme, which is from parking house to urban space. And this has emerged through a project that you probably know of ours, right? It's the Konditaget Lüders parking house, the Park and Play, which is located in the northern harbour. It's a new urban development in the north of Copenhagen. For any of you who don't know, it's this bright red building sitting right here at the foreshore, which is an interesting location for a parking house, right? Giving it such like prominence in a new urban development. And I actually like to start talking about this project through this image, not because it's showing the building, but it's actually showing the street. Because I think it's important to address the master plan of this area and what the function of this building actually is. And its primary function is actually so that there is zero street parking on the street. I think if you notice it, there's place for trees, place for bicycle parking, because it's all been accumulated within that building. It's a funny little side story that it was built there, you know, because these new residents obviously wanted a car space, and it was designed so it was no more than 200 meters away from the apartments. But because there's that little inconvenience and really great public transportation infrastructure and the bicycle networks, it's underutilized. It's not full of cars because people have chosen not to buy one even though they have the option to do it. One of the primary tasks that we had to do within this project was to design a new public space and recreational facility as part of it. Because I think that's the interesting part of this project, that it's not just a car park, but it's considering what can these types of infrastructure actually give back. And it was like an interesting project because we were inspired by the kind of red brick and red tile of the existing industrial area before it was being transformed into this new urban development. And so to kind of continue that red thread, we literally made a red thread that would kind of connect from one side of the building to form a number of different scales of spaces that are recreational for, say, like playgrounds, kids with families, urban spaces for visitors, but also recreational facilities for the local CrossFit club. And this red thread, what it did is, I mean, this is a public space on top of a car park. It's 6 stories above. And so you need a way to kind of bring people up to that space. And so this first element of the red thread was this grand staircase that was inspired by the Centre Pompidou in Paris, leading up to the kind of urban space that I think people might know. But you can see here how the red thread is kind of containing and forming all these different uses within it. It's kind of like the framework for the rest of the building to work. As a little side note, that I think really funny, this photo is taken from one of the most expensive apartments in Copenhagen. And you've essentially got the same view on a publicly accessible rooftop just next door. And I think there's something nice about that, and I think it really represents, you know, Danish architecture, that you try and embed these public spaces in buildings as much as possible. Yeah, so as I said before, the red thread is then forming these different types of spaces which are for all the different kind of user groups, whether that is the kind of CrossFit guys that love it. There's like a little timer that you can like run up one stair, you can do all the exercises and get back down, to all the families and kids because you don't have the kind of playgrounds like you do in other areas, to then just like people coming and hanging, like, you know, getting a coffee and a pastry and just coming up and enjoying the view. It's quite amazing. My personal favorite spot is this trampoline center, which we have, which is located just above the kind of spiral ramp which takes cars up the top. And so what's crazy about it is that when you're looking down, you just have this 6-story height between you and the ground, right? It's quite concerning when you look down. But I can assure you with our engineers that it's safe. And if you're ever in Copenhagen, you should definitely visit it because it's amazing. The next project is another parking house that we've done, this time in the south of Copenhagen. And while this wasn't so much about how to create a rooftop public space, it was about how these kind of buildings can still provide urban qualities on the ground level. So a big challenge when you're designing these types of buildings is that they're essentially one volume with no program, right? And so a lot of our task was then how do we kind of break up this giant mass into a human scale that can address people as they're walking along it. And we were inspired by the artist Mondrian to kind of produce this very strict grid structure that would kind of dissolve as you move further towards the base. But on the other side, we were planting these kind of green planters that would rise up, so that you would have this nice kind of intersection of the organic planters kind of rising from the bottom and the kind of strict grid of the facade kind of coming down from the top. Materially, we kind of separated the building into two functions. We have this kind of plinth, which is addressing the human scale, built out of brick, kind of various brick patterns, you know, with the kind of pattern of the facade. And then as you kind of rise to the top, we had the corten steel with these kind of bigger spaces. And what that meant is that as you're kind of moving along, this building doesn't feel so big. It actually addresses the human scale quite well. And the brick actually allows you to carve out different niches to provide maybe not necessarily like, you know, big programs, but important amenities such as benches for people to sit, for little places for you to park your bike. And so that these buildings should also be contributing in some way to the local surrounding, not just taking away. The final theme that I'm going to talk to you about, which I think plays out with these parking houses. It's been a development, right? Because it might be a bit funny for me to kind of get up here and say, we need to get rid of cars and then show you a lot of parking houses, you know, which is the broad, like, big part of our work. And so a very important thing that we need to consider is that we have a need today and we have an ambition for the future, and there's a long transition period between it. You know, I don't expect no cars tomorrow. We need to do this in a sensible manner. And so we need to think about how the buildings that we doing today, we can design them flexibly so that they can still sustainably meet those goals for the future. So I'm going to give you a little rundown, maybe overview of what I think parking houses are, right? We kind of have the underground parking basement, which I guess is kind of prevalent in so many new urban developments, because you think, we get rid of the cars, everything looks nice on top. But if we're thinking about this transition, these kind of structures are incredibly unsustainable because they cost a lot. You know, they require a lot of energy to build underground. You have to excavate a huge amount of soil, and they essentially can't be used for anything afterwards. So if we're changing and trying to go to other modes of transportation, we're just going to be left with all these like basements everywhere. The next kind of typology that we have is the kind of above ground, kind of standard, cheap parking house that you all might know. And I would say maybe it's a little bit better than the basement, but I mean, it's essentially going to be destroyed if we were to move around. Because with these kind of structures, you have these very deep bays, and you have very low floor-to-ceiling heights. So you essentially can't do anything with them because you can't get the daylight required to, say, convert it to another program. And it doesn't give you the space to actually do anything nice with it. The next, which is our red parking house, Kondi, that we love, we're still a little bit critical of it, right? Because although it provides this amazing urban space on top, and it has these ground floor amenities which contribute to the local area, it still is built out of steel and concrete. So if we're moving to a future where we want less cars, this type of building is going to become obsolete. And so for the last 2 years, maybe, JAJA has been trying to develop a new typology of parking house that's built out of timber. And I know, like, people automatically think, like, fire, you know, it's going to collapse. And this is, like, the #1 consideration, right? Especially when we move to electric cars, because when those batteries blow up, it causes some serious damage. But these are the kind of tests that we're doing, and you can see in the manufacturers that they're thinking it and can design these types of redundancies into the structures so it doesn't matter. I think what's really cool about this building, and the thing that you'll notice initially, is that the bay structure is set up differently. Because we're using a different building material, we provide a different type of construction method, which means that we can start to design this with flexibility in mind. because of the timber, the way it's being put together, you can actually start to remove it and think of new flexible uses for it in the future. So in this particular example, it's not only going to be used for housing cars, but as we hopefully transition away from cars, we can start to change this into housing by removing some of these bays so that you still have the adequate kind of depth to allow adequate daylight. You still have the floor to ceiling height in order to put in new program. And what's really cool is developers really like it because they kind of double up. They can kind of make money on the make money on the parking to begin with, and then kind of take a little bet that if they want to do something else in the future, they can. So it's this kind of little insurance policy that you can put in. Where we're starting to see most success with this type of building technology is in Norway. Because, I mean, they do a lot in timber there. And where I think we've also tried to embrace this idea of flexibility is not only in the structure, but also in the program. And so we're starting to move away from calling these buildings parking houses and towards mobility hubs. Because a mobility hub is much more interesting in that you can start to use it as a way to transition people away from using a car all the time. It doesn't only have to house cars, but can house all types of mobility options. And like I showed you before, mobility options that can start to really be suited to the type of journey that people are having. And a lot of this work is really about the ground floor, right? So that you can create space for shared cars, space for charging infrastructure, space for shared cargo bikes, but also kind of programs that support it. So like bike workshops, you can have little logistics centers so that you can transfer packages from large vans to the cargo bikes to go around. It's really about thinking what types of mobility should actually be in these and allowing for it. The cool thing, I think I've said before with the transformation of these buildings, in this particular parking house in Norway, the way we designed it is to have the kind of access ramp that you might traditionally have on either side actually in the middle of it. So that when we start transitioning away from the need for cars and we can start going layer by layer, floor by floor, converting it into other modes, we can actually just start removing the central core, because that allows a nice little courtyard then. So then you start getting daylight on either side. And I can show you in this diagram how this system is essentially working. Where you can see on the left-hand side, it's kind of 5 meters, 7 meters, 5 meters. That's the way you structure it with parking either side. And then you simply just take one of the 5 meters away. So then you have a 12-meter depth apartment with a nice little balcony. And the way that these kind of apartments are working is kind of like a little Tetris, a little zigzag, where you can see that on either side they're getting these double height living room spaces while being connected to bedrooms on either side. And it works this way as a little Tetris game as you go through. And I think, yes, cool, it worked. I think this is where I want to really end this talk, with this kind of image showing you this. I mean, either side is going to get a different vision of this. It's basically showing the transition of this building from 100% parking on one side to these kind of new types of apartment dwellings on the other. And the reason why I want to end this is because I kind of want to inspire you a little bit, right? To even if you might enjoy this mobility kind of topic, but feel a little bit disheartened by the way that cars are embedded in our society, there are ways to rethink the types of typologies of buildings that we're using and how they can be then used to actually promote a green transition in the future. I think that's really where the power of the architect in this whole discussion about mobility and transportation really is, because we can kind of use our spatial thinking to inspire others to go a different way. And with that, I'll say thank you, and yeah.
Okay. So thank you very much for the presentation. I think we have a lot to get inspired from. And also, I already got some questions from slido.com. If anybody else has questions here, you can ask them. If you are shy to ask in English, you can ask in Czech. We can translate it. It's no problem. My colleagues have microphones, so just raise your hands because of the recording. So I will start with these questions on Slido. So the first one is what JAJA means. The second one is how important is context of place in your work. So maybe you can get these two. The third one is a bit personal. Okay,
I'm worried. So JAJA means yes, yes. For anyone that knows Danish, ja equals yes. So I guess it's more like yeah, yeah. Which is really just our approach toward architecture. I think even though I kind of was very specific in terms of mobility, hopefully you saw from those introductory slides the kind of, can-do attitude for new types of projects that we try to do. And then I guess you see this kind of playful approach that we try and bring into it. To answer the second question, context is extremely important. And I think this is where, being an architect stepping into this realm of mobility has been really successful, because I think architects are a little bit context sensitive to begin with. I think a lot of people see transport as something that can be replicated from kind of context to context. And we've kind of got that because of the car. Because it didn't matter if it was like the streets of San Francisco or Rome or Delhi, the car can kind of just go wherever it wants. But if we're starting to go to this future mobility where we're using lots of different types of vehicles, it becomes really important in terms of context, right? We can't just take Copenhagen, which is a flat city, and therefore has this really rich cycling culture, and just transplant that to a really hilly environment, because it just won't be adopted in that same way. So you need to reconsider, what is the existing kind of physical context, what is the social context, what is the economic context, and that is what really drives the design response to it.
That's a really good answer, because here when you are trying to do the cycling infrastructure, there's the argument that the Prague is quite hilly and it's not so easy to get by bike here. So the third one, the question for you. Yeah. But if anybody has a question, just raise your hands. So can you recommend any book which inspires you, except your PhD book? There's the specific note that except your PhD book, because you finished a PhD for sustainable urban mobility, and we will include a book in our library. So.
Yeah, I mean, maybe it's a fairly typical example, but I would say Left Between Buildings by Jan Gehl is like an extremely important book that a lot of people should read. And I see a lot of people nodding, so maybe it wasn't the most interesting answer in terms of it. But I think it's inspiring for architects to think beyond the plot, because I think that's where we're confined a little bit. We're just like, okay, here's the boundary division, this is where I'm gonna work. Whereas, if we start engaging much more with the street, we can have, a much more larger impact on the city overall.
Okay, thanks. Anybody has a question? There's a question, please. So just wait for the microphone. Thanks.
Hello, thank you for the presentation. My question is because I remember I saw you a few years ago. You didn't speak about mobility at all. And I'm very interested in when you have decided as JAJA to focus on research. And also, I'm very interested in the economy of JAJA when you consider commercial projects and research projects. What is the percentage of how much you do research, how much you do commercial, and also perhaps if you are if the city, for instance, is helping you or funding you in some way in order to do the research.
Yep, cool. So the first question, which is about when did we adopt mobility as one of these core pillars? And it really came out of the Red Parking House. I think that was like the eye-opener for us to be like, okay, this is the impact that transportation infrastructure has, and it's also how can it be much better? But that was like the first little step in to get us thinking. And it was probably around 2016 when like a lot of hype was happening around autonomous vehicles, like really, really high. Like people were like, 2020, like we're not gonna drive cars. It's all gonna be done for us. And I think we got caught up in that a little bit. Where we thought, cool, like we get rid of parking, we can build, like, we can do so many cool things. And then we surely quickly realized that okay, first of all, I think autonomous vehicles are a long way away, if they'll ever happen, in the sense that we might think. And second of all, there's just like low-hanging fruit that we can take, you know, like bicycles and micromobility that get us to that same goal much easier. And so I think that's just what happened. And the more we started to get interested in it, and the more we started to embed these ideas into our urban planning projects, which I haven't really touched upon tonight, the more it just made more sense for it to become one of our defining ways that we would actually approach it. The second question was the makeup between research and projects. It's a really hard question because, first of all, research is like a really broad term, right? Like, because we're kind of embedding aspects of research into all our projects anyway. We're also quite a kind of unsolicited firm where we're chasing projects. We're trying to produce, like, make our own projects. And so that also requires a little bit of research for us to produce the material in order to go after it. So I can't really say, but like, I would say that we're building a lot. I would say 90% is commercial projects, 10% research as like a strict kind of division, but many of those projects are involving research in many ways. Could you give me a keyword for your third question? Okay.
It was if the city municipality is helping you with the research, right? Was it the third part?
Yep. Really good question. We have allies and people who maybe make it a little bit difficult in the municipality. I mean, the municipality is a huge organization. They don't fund any of the work they do. We try and involve them in like pilot projects. This is our main contribution with them, where they can come with funding to actually build stuff or expertise with ours, rather than them just giving us a bunch of money and letting us do what they want. We do get commissioned to do studies occasionally when they're kind of interested in our work, but they're not just saying like, go do research, that. But they're very supportive. You know, they want to hear our thoughts. They bring us in for collaborative meetings. They're willing to be part of workshops with many different stakeholders, both private and public actors.
I believe there was a question on this side, right? Was somebody raising the hand? No? Yeah, so back in the...
Hi, thank you for a presentation. I've been there in Copenhagen a couple times and I love it, so thank you so much for it, to see that. So my question is, you saw our city today, so I would like to ask you, do you have any idea what to do better in our city, as you are doing actually in Copenhagen? Thank you.
Yep. Thank you for your question. I actually met with the planning department today, and it was really insightful to kind of share knowledge of, you know, how we're approaching it in Copenhagen, what's happening here. I actually think my impression was that the planners were a little bit negative. Like, you know, they felt under all these struggles, where when I was here, I only saw all the positives, right? Like, I mean, these like amazing Prague mosaics that you have on the ground, you have these really wide sidewalks. These are things that we don't have in Copenhagen. So you kind of have these like first steps in order to make things happen. I mean, the obvious thing is that you need to increase on-street parking places so they're not seen as a right. You know, they're actually valued as a piece of public space, so that then you can have a discussion of like, is this the best use? I mean, I don't know enough about the economics of Prague to really make a suggestion. Maybe cars are very essential to the city, but it rarely is. And so then you might put the case of like, you know, do trees, do like alfresco dining, do places to park cars, do they actually provide more benefits, not only in terms of, you know, the environment, but also actually for the city in terms of economy? So you would do some kind of studies. I think you should definitely close this highway that runs through the city center. It just seems crazy to me. But like, once again, I mean, you know, that's a very brief thing, but you know, these kind of super boulevards that I was describing before, that it's this exact same principle, that you already have the width there, so you have capacity to do something with it. It's just like, maybe it shouldn't be 100% cars on it.
My colleague will take the microphone. Yeah. Are there any questions? I have one from Slido. It's how do you see our role as architects and planners for the future of our climate crisis? And maybe it can connect to the three pillars you were speaking about: the mobility, the biomaterials, and reusing the places. Yeah. The transformation. Yeah. So what do you think of the 3 pillars is the most important, and how does it connect to the climate crisis?
Yeah. I mean, as you will have actually seen with the projects, I don't really differentiate with them. I think the way I set up the presentation was very much, now we're doing a biomaterial project, and now we're doing a transformation, and now we're doing a mobility. But you know, with this kind of project, it's encapsulating all 3. It's taking aspects of transformation, it's taking aspects of biomaterials and aspects of mobility. And what you'll see actually with all our projects is they're combining. So I don't think there's a more important one, except maybe mobility, but I wouldn't say that. I think the first question was a really interesting question, but it's also really hard because you're basically asking what is the role of the architect. And I think since we moved on from this like modern era of like the master architect who does the sketch, the profession has kind of diversified, where you have many different roles of architects that basically take their training as spatial planners and designers and applies it to different problems. So whether that's like reworking services, whether it's designing nice details, whether it's speccing timber over concrete, or maybe more my work, which is much more like inspirational, like, you know, trying to work at that visionary level. There's lots of different ways in which architects contribute. I think what's important is more to understand the challenge, because once you understand what those challenges are, whether it's people are having too many cars in cities, people are using concrete instead of timber, then you can think of, okay, how as an architect can address it. I would also say, to add to it, it's really important to start working in teams, because this idea that the architect can do everything is just completely wrong. It's about understanding what, you know, the capabilities of the architect and what the strengths are, and then finding the necessary disciplines to collaborate with, because that's really the only way we're going to go forward, instead of these maybe like on your own doing wild kind of plans and then kind of projecting it out.
Okay, thanks. Does anybody else? So there's a lady in the first row.
Thank you for your presentation. And I'm not sure if you told about that, but if you got a feedback to the road, I mean, for your road presentation, because it's about infrastructure of the city, if you already presented to government or people from those areas, and what the feedback you got from them.
Mm-hmm. So that particular project is like a method of this like backcasting, right? So it's about like creating this vision, which is about generating stakeholder support and kind of bringing people on board and then figuring out how to get there. And I think primarily when you show to politicians, the number one like question is, how much does it cost? Because like, you know, that's what they want to know. That's how they see things. And I find it a really interesting question that people see the cost as the mitigating factor, because I mean, transportation infrastructure projects just cost so much money. The pandemic has cost so much money. Like in Denmark, the amount of welfare has been spent is just like astronomical. And so it's not a matter of like, you know, how much does it cost? It's just about finding the money if it's something that we want to do. And so I think the project is more about gaining support and then not necessarily trying to build that proposal tomorrow, but maybe trying to figure out what the next step is in order to kind of move in the right direction.
So to try find some support and bring this idea together.
Yeah, because I mean, like, it depends who you ask. If you ask a climate activist, they're just like, when can this happen? You know, they like, you know, you get lots of different questions from lots of different parties depending on what their kind of their space is. And that's really important, because you want these questions, because more questions that come out, the more rich the idea can get. The kind of version of the presentation I've just shown you isn't what it started. It's been evolving over like 18 months now, because we get these questions, we get this input from different stakeholders, and the design keeps changing along the way. And that's the way it should be.
Thanks.
It connects to another question we get online. So how difficult is it to make the decision makers to be open to these ideas? And how difficult is it to convince them that these ideas are good for the future?
Yep, I think it's getting easier. Because even in Copenhagen, we've had a pretty car-friendly administration. But what's happened is that you've got cities like Paris and Barcelona kind of creating these like huge grand plans to go car-free in the 15-minute city. And I think what happens is once you get one visionary mayor who makes a bold decision and other mayors see that, they weren't voted out of office, people are actually happier. It provides this precedent for actually more mayors to come along. And I think for a long time, Copenhagen has been this model. People look to Copenhagen. But as I said before, with the increase of cars, maybe it's going to shift to another city. And then that's another way for a decision maker to be like, okay, maybe we need to actually do something because we're going to be knocked off this podium as one of the world's cycling capitals.
We can teach you how to build highways through the city.
Yeah, no worries.
Yeah. Does anybody else has a question? So another one from the guy in the first row.
I would just like to ask if you could tell me the function of the gantry wall you're doing next to the castle.
Yeah, it's a museum.
Because you just showed one slide, which was very sexy, but
yeah, sorry.
It's a museum.
It was more just so people didn't think that JAJA was mobility, right? Because we do a lot of different projects. It's a museum. Sorry if I brushed over that.
Is it? Can I see it somewhere? Is it presented on your webpage?
I think so.
Okay, thank you.
Pretty sure.
I'll have a look.
Yep.
Okay. So if there are not any more questions, so I will close it with the last question, which bothers me the most.
Okay.
So everybody could hear that you are a very good English speaker.
Yeah.
So you are not native Danish born.
No.
So you are from Australia.
Mm-hmm.
What did brought you from Australia to Copenhagen?
Yep. It's a very long story, so I need to think of a really quick version. But
we close at 9. We have time.
Okay. Can I have a chair, please? Maybe you've heard of the Sydney Opera House. It's a very famous building in Sydney, where I'm from, and it was designed by a Danish architect called Jørgensen. And basically, I was inspired by his work, and at the same time as I was in architecture school, was like the rise of this new wave of Danish architecture. So people like Bjarke Ingels, Kobe, Adept, Effect, this was all going on. And for me in Australia, I saw it as this revolution in the way that architecture is communicated and designed. It kind of made a lot of sense with their principles of urban space, always providing back to people. And essentially I wanted to be part of it. So I kind of just packed up one day and moved to Denmark. Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank you for the presentation. Thank you for coming. Huge applause for Robert.
Thanks. Thanks. Thanks.
So we hope that we will see you soon, that we will not close again. Watch our program at prague.camp or campoid.online, and see you soon. Thank you for coming.